What I'm going to cover today is basically, I'm an enterprise architect by training, and I'm an alumnus of MIT Sloan School of Management, so I'm by definition, I'm a systems thinker, system dynamics person. So I always try to use systems thinking, system dynamics to deal with complex issues. And cloud computing, cloud adoption is an important element that many organizations are looking at, because whenever I go and talk to, CXOs, it could be CFOs, CEOs, chief operating officers, and chief information officers, one of the questions they would be asking me is cloud as good as it claims to be? And obviously there are vendors who keep saying that cloud is the silver bullet, it's going to solve all your problems, but in reality it doesn't, right? And there are many issues that organizations need to take into consideration from a cloud adoption perspective. So my presentation, my session today focuses not on the technology to make cloud more efficient. So this is not what Amazon or Cisco or Huawei should be doing in terms of building better, cloud farms. That's not the point here. The point is, what I'm presenting here is from a, point of view of how what organizations need to take into consideration before you want to adopt cloud, into your infrastructure, so to speak. And what is important is what I'm going to present. So I also have an academic background, so understand academic research. Now I'm into the industry, so it's a good mix of academia and industry research. So what is important, you will see that most of the issues pertaining to cloud computing, adoption of cloud, is actually a business decision, right? There's very little technology implications of cloud. I think something that even Jerry alluded to earlier in his session. So before I move on to the session itself and present some of the findings from my research that I did, this is the technical definition of cloud computing as provided by NIST. So I did not invent this definition. This is the official definition. Cloud computing is a model for enabling convenient on-demand network access to shared pool of computing resources, which could be network servers, storage applications, services that can be rapidly provisioned and released with minimal management effort or cloud provider interaction. So the idea here is cloud gives you access to infrastructure, cloud gives you access to services in an on-demand basis, which means you get it when you need it. So it's almost like all of the infrastructure, all of the services become a utility model, right? And you kind of subscribe to it and pay for it. So obviously there is a lot of benefit to it, and this is how computing was supposed to be anyway. And in a business parlance, so there's nothing technical about this, right? So it gives you flexibility, it makes your infrastructure scalable, encourages, promotes the pay-per-use model, right? Because you don't pay for the entire infrastructure in terms of the technology infrastructure, but you just pay for the service that you're using, so which is very good, works excellent for organizations where information technology is not the core business, right? So suppose you're a transportation company, you're an airline company, you're a bank, you have better things to do than worry about information technology infrastructure. It's largely an elastic model because you have the cloud service provider who has the infrastructure in place. So if you need more capability for a few days because there is a financial closing, right, year-ending closing, and you need 1 week of huge capability, you can provide. The cloud service provider can provide. So it's almost like the power companies who provide power, right? You just plug into the power. You don't worry about how the power company is producing power, whether it's nuclear power or coal power or hydroelectric, who cares, right? So that's the kind of model that cloud actually encourages, and that's the good thing about cloud. Now, to understand the cloud ecosystem, you'll see that there are a few things that exist in the cloud ecosystem. Obviously, at the bottom, you have the infrastructure providers, right? Then some of these infrastructure providers have done a forward integration to become cloud service providers. So I'll show you the list of cloud service providers later. So that's the service provider part of the ecosystem, right? Then you have the people or the organizations who consume cloud services. So you have individual people. So for instance, if you're using Office 365, right, it is a cloud-based for individual organizations. Then you have small and medium organizations, you have large enterprises, and obviously you have governments, right? Now, yesterday we were presenting, and one of the things that came up very clearly was that cloud provides ability even for small and medium enterprises to have access to great infrastructure, something that they wouldn't be because they don't have deep pockets. right? A large organization and government can definitely have their own infrastructure, but SMEs and individuals don't have that kind of financial strength to really adopt, have on-premise capability. Therefore, cloud works very well for them. One of the things that we found in the research is within the ecosystem, which really contributes to success or failure of cloud adoption, is having the legal and regulatory framework. I'll talk about that later. Right? This comes up as a showstopper. There's no technology. Technology does not come up even for discussion. Right? Cloud adopters don't care about how the cloud service providers provide the technology to give them the service. What they're talking about is what are the legal and regulatory implications of adopting cloud. Okay, and this can become a great research topic which connects both technology and business. So some of you who are looking, who could be PhD students or master's students, what I will do is by the end of this session, I'll give you a few questions which could give you some direction about few new research topics. We were talking about policy areas, so these are some of the areas that that are important from a United Nations report. So the sources here, fairly recent, 2013. So look at the areas that are important from a cloud adoption perspective, right? There are tax implications. What happens if your data sits in a server which is in another country which has a different tax regulation? Which regulation applies? Is it Taiwan's regulation or is it the other country's regulation? There are massive issues that need to be resolved, right? Cross-border flow of data. Yesterday I was talking, I work in the government area, right? Public sector and government area. One of the things that governments always ask me is that if the cloud service provider is sitting in another country, isn't it a national security problem? I'm putting all my data on another server. Where is technology in this? Nowhere. Nobody discusses technology. Right? Think about it. All of your country's data, it could be financial data, it could be personal data, could be sitting on another server in another country, which could be hostile to you. Right? So there's a issue of privacy and security. Obviously, broadband infrastructure. I think most developed countries have solved this, and you do get access to good infrastructure. Standardization is important. We don't have enough skilled people to understand the implications of cloud. I'll show you what are the skills required. And obviously, we need a lot of R&D. And one thing that I have seen is that if governments adopt cloud, that becomes a good, I would say, example for other organizations to also adopt cloud. So there are few things that are important. I'm going to deal with some of these in details through the research that I did. Now, obviously, if you see my presentation was an enterprise architecture perspective. So let me define what enterprise architecture is for the benefit of those who don't know what it is. So I define enterprise architecture as the ongoing process of building the ability to manage complexity. So any kind of architecture is to deal with ability to deal with complexity with the goal of creating coherent and future-ready enterprises. So I came up with the definition in 2012 in I think that was my 4th book where I came up with this definition. So this became a big idea and eventually became a paper in Harvard Business Review. So you can see the paper there, right? And if you're interested, you could download this paper and understand what coherence is all about. Now, if you're still thinking what enterprise architecture consists of before I go back to the cloud part of it, because you will see the linkage between the two, it consists of these building blocks. You have the policy and strategy architecture on top, followed by the business architecture. So the policy and strategy architecture is where the overall vision, mission, the direction, and the focus areas are established, so to speak. Then you have the business architecture, which focuses on the capabilities and the processes, right? So that's your internal aspect. And you have the services and products, that's your external aspect, because this is how you interact with your customers and consumers. Followed by the more technically oriented building blocks. So you have the data architecture, right? Jerry was talking about data analytics, application architecture. So these are your software systems, and your technology infrastructure, which comes in the building block of technology architecture. And if you see this picture looks like a house, and you know that a house requires a strong foundation, and that foundation is provided by governance and management. What I have seen in my 15, 16 years of work experience is that many organizations deal with these building blocks on top quite well, but because they do not have a strong governance and management, they are unable to sustain a strong architecture. There is no point of building an architecture blueprint if you cannot enforce it in the organization. It is just shelfware. It just becomes a file, goes into some cabinet somewhere. So that's where the governance and management is coming, right? Remember in my previous slide, I showed you standardization. So one of the reasons why organizations adopt architecture is to adopt technology standards, right? Now, what's the point of defining technology standards if your project managers, if your IT managers, if your business managers don't adopt those standards? It's like following traffic rules. If all of us bring our own traffic rules, we won't be able to move on the roads, right? We have to follow certain traffic rules, whether we like it or not. It's the same thing with technology standards. Okay, I will not go into the details of enterprise architecture anymore because that is not the context here, but I think it gives you a general flavor of what enterprise architecture consists of, right? Now, why is this important? Because the levels of architecture are directly related to the cloud service model that you're looking at. These are the different cloud service models. Infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, data as a service, business process as a service, each linked to the direct layers that I showed you earlier on my previous slide. All right? Now, what is more important, I'll show you one slide later on. Most organizations at this point, from an adoption perspective, are focusing on this and this, not so much on this and that. Because what happens is once you get to the business logic where the business rule comes in and the corporate data, it becomes very organization specific. This is where your core competence is. This is where the security and the privacy issue becomes important. Here, it doesn't matter. If my laptop is HP or Lenovo or whatever, any other brand, who cares as long as it works? It's a commodity, right? Here, yes, there are common applications that you could build across the enterprise, and therefore you can take benefit of providing it as a platform. All right? Now, from a cloud adoption point of view, there are a few steps that organizations typically go through. So that's your y-axis. You have to do some initial planning. I'll show you the steps later on. Understand what your capabilities are and understand what you want to achieve through your cloud adoption. Come up with the architecture, so that's where architecture comes in. Do a gap analysis. Where are you vis-a-vis the target architecture? So you do need to understand what your current architecture is. Do some kind of an implementation planning. And finally, most important point, as I've highlighted in my slide earlier, governance. This is directly linked to TOGAF. TOGAF is an architecture methodology. There is an ADM there. All of the phases of ADM are there, and you can see the linkage. For those of you who don't know, TOGAF is the Open Group Architecture Framework. It's actually an open framework. It's not a proprietary vendor-specific framework for architecture development. What this slide shows you is that as you do your architecture development through the different phases, you could use it to build your cloud adoption strategy. All right? With that basic context, I'll build certain system models to show you how the adoption actually goes through based on the research that I did over the past 3 years. Now, typically, what we have seen is that the first reason, or the reason that triggers discussion about cloud adoption, is actually cost. A lot of the organizations think that their IT budgets are in pressure. I mean, you saw Jerry presenting that. Therefore, there is always a kind of pressure on the CIO and the CTO to reduce cost, which leads to some level of rationalization, some standardization, need for shared services, and that kind of provides demand for making the IT infrastructure more efficient. That is typically the triggering discussion for adoption of cloud. Whether that is right or wrong, that is a different point of view. No, it's a little bit like open source, right? A lot of people think open source is free. It's actually not free. It could be more expensive than proprietary technology. So this is, I call the nodal loop, because this is the central idea that triggers the discussion about cloud adoption. Now, it is based on research findings. Here is a survey done, and you can see this is the topmost issue that comes up for discussion, both in the government sector and the private sector: cost. Most CEOs, COOs assume, and CFOs, of course, we are dealing with cost, think that cloud will therefore reduce their IT budgets, IT costs. There are other reasons, but cost is by far the most important factor. And one way, if you go back to the previous slide, one way to reduce cost is to rationalize your IT infrastructure and standardize. So see what happens when organizations standardize on technology. Standardization definitely reduces cost. It makes your decision better, because let's say if my organization has standardized on Microsoft and HP, there is no decision required, right? We know that anything that we purchase is going to be Microsoft and HP. That's not, it doesn't require any major, decision of the CXOs to figure out what should we be discussing. However, there are downsides of standardization. Number one, if the corporate IT has decided on certain technology standards, there is a big danger that we have seen in our research, is that there's an emergence of something called shadow IT. Do you know what shadow IT is? So the IT department, the CIO and the IT department focus on adopting the standards as defined by the architecture. I'm a business department, I don't like those standards because I think those don't meet those requirements, so what do? I set up my own small IT department in my division, which do not follow the standards. So I'm running a shadow IT department in my own division. Okay, because I don't agree with the overall corporate standards. And the second thing that organizations worry about is when you standardize, let's say you chose HP. I'm giving HP as an example, right? What happens if HP goes out of business? I'm locked into the vendor. And there is a big risk on that, right? One of the reasons why organizations don't want to standardize on technology is because it locks them down to one vendor, and therefore you cannot adopt other vendors' technology which may be better at that time. Okay, common sense. But what is important is balancing the benefit of standardization with the downsides of standardization. So what is important for you to understand from a strategic perspective, we are not talking technology here, from a strategic perspective is how do you balance this and this? Organizations typically don't do a good job. I'll walk you through the other slides. When you talk of standardization, it works great here. So this is the degree of standardization. Architecture layers, but not at the process and the strategy level. You don't go and actually say, I'm going to standardize on strategy. I mean, that doesn't make sense at all, right? You want to come up with a strategy where you want to differentiate compared to your competition. You don't want to standardize. You can see that. Right? That's the reason why adoption of cloud has been more successful at the lower levels here. Infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, not so much at the business process level. Because business process and business strategy is what provides you the competitive differentiation. Okay? Moving forward with the same system model, adoption of cloud gives you agility because now you have access to IT infrastructure that you wouldn't have access otherwise because IT is not your core business, and it does give you cost flexibility. One of the reasons what cloud adoption does is change your CapEx to OpEx, capital expenditure to operating expenditure, because now you're not buying the infrastructure, you're just using it on a pay-per-use basis. And that is a big change from a CFO perspective. Think of it, this is what CFOs understand. CFOs don't worry about how many racks you have and what is the capability, bandwidth capability that you need. They don't care about that stuff. So that is the pay-per-use model, which focuses on changing CapEx to OpEx, which is a great benefit from a financial perspective. The other thing is adoption of cloud definitely reduces redundancy in your IT operations, increases the speed of adoption, and therefore gives you agility. If for 1 week in a year you need greater capability simply because you have a big sale going on, let's say you're a consumer company, you have a big sale going on, right? If you didn't have access to cloud, what would you do? You would actually have to buy those servers. Now, those servers would be useful for that 1 week in the 52 weeks that you have the year, in the year. The remaining 51 weeks, they will be underutilized. Right? So that's the typical model. If you have access to cloud, you can get access to that higher computing power for only that 1 week that you need, and you pay for it. It's like having a taxi along with public transport and your personal car. Therefore, cloud allows you to deal with technology obsolescence. One of the things that we have with information technology is that by the time you get this laptop, it is already outdated. Okay? Now it's fine. It's a $1,000 laptop, doesn't matter. If you have invested $10 million on servers and that technology goes obsolete, that is a lot of money for the CFO. Right? Why is this an important factor? Because from a cloud adoption perspective, you don't have to worry if that server or that technology goes outdated, right? Because it is the cloud service provider's responsibility. I don't care about it as an adopter. Make sense? All right. So what happens is, as organizations start adopting cloud services, there is a need to define SLAs. This is not a picnic. There has to be service level agreements between providers and consumers. Because it's important from an adoption perspective, as a consumer of cloud technology, your business depends on the availability of that cloud service provider. Think what happens if there is a power cut. Half of your work will be closed, shut down. It's the same thing with cloud, which means you need service level agreements and some transparency and certain, I would say, mitigators to deal with performance risks. All right? And I have introduced these topics to you earlier. So these are the cloud service models, and you have to define service level agreements for each of this model depending on what you choose. As I told you, most organizations have not gone here and here because this is where you don't want to put it on the cloud. This is something that you want to hold on to your organization. Within your organization, that provides your core capability. Other things doesn't matter, it's infrastructure. When you define your service level agreements, what are the things that you have to take into consideration? Remember, this is from a cloud adoption perspective, not a cloud service provider perspective, right? I keep emphasizing on that point. You need to understand who are the parties involved. Right? Are you an SME? Are you an individual? Are you a large organization? Who's going to set up the cloud? What kind of service deployment models you're looking at? Are you looking at a public cloud going to Amazon as an example, or are you going to look at a private cloud? Many questions to be answered. Understand what your policies are pertaining to security, pertaining to privacy, what kind of data you deal with, right? Understand the deployment model differences. I'll show you the deployment models a little later with some definitions and some key areas. Define the performance objectives. If your cloud service provider is able to give you 99.9% availability, is that good enough? Do you really need 99.999? It's up to you. That's your decision. There's no right or wrong answer. You figure out what is the availability that you need. These are not technical questions, right? I spoke about security and privacy, defining the service level agreements. What happens? What are the ramifications? What are the consequences if your service provider fails? Right? There will be business impact. There will be business continuity impact. What is the impact on you from a revenue perspective? You have to understand that aspect when you define your SLAs. It failed, so how do you recover? You need to have a recovery plan. Right? Imagine you put your ATM card in the ATM machine and money doesn't come out. What happens? You're very angry at the bank, right? Probably the bank is using a cloud service provider who failed at that very moment. So imagine the reputational damage for the bank. I wouldn't ever go to that bank again. Okay? And obviously there's an effective management process through the entire life cycle. And finally, it's important, if you're not happy with the cloud service provider, you need to think of an exit plan. That is extremely important, right? What happens, as I gave you, what happens if you standardize on a specific cloud service provider who has standardized on a technology, but that organization goes out of business? Okay, so all of these factors are extremely important for you to think about from a cloud adoption perspective. Moving on, using the same data. So as organizations transition towards cloud, other factors come in. So this is transition to cloud. So this is the cloud ecosystem coming together, cost of transition. Now, there are different cost factors. You have service failure cost, hard to measure. Initial setup cost, you have recurring cost, and you have termination cost. All of these things need to be factored in when you come up with your service level agreements with your cloud service provider. So let's see the cost factors. Are you ready, right? I mean, many times we are called into engagements where the first question that the client actually asks us, yes, we have these infrastructure, we have these applications, are they cloud ready? In most cases, because of the legacy systems, they are not cloud ready. They cannot be put on the cloud because the way they have been designed, the way they have been architected. Right? So again, it is a decision point for the customer, because the customer then says, I have invested millions of dollars on these legacy technology. Is it worth moving to the cloud? It's a business decision. Right? So that's the first thing. Your implementation and integration, right? You will typically have to choose what services you want to put on the cloud. No organization is going to put everything on the cloud. It's always going to be a hybrid approach. Certain infrastructure will be on the cloud, certain infrastructure will be on-premise, so on and so forth. Right? Configuration, customization, training is important. People have to understand how to, work with cloud technology, and of course the organizational change aspect. Then you have the recurring cost. It's a pay-per-use model, so you have to pay a subscription fee, right? There's a change management, managing vendors, coordinating with different clouds, end-user support, risk mitigation, downsize, upsize. And finally, not to be forgotten, equally important is termination cost. What is your cost of coming out of that agreement with your cloud service provider? Okay. Keep moving. Right. As I said, organizations will not move lock, stock, and barrel, which means they will not move everything to the cloud. It's always going to be a mix between your on-premise infrastructure and your cloud infrastructure, what we call is the multi-environment structure. All right? And that is coming out as a factor in our research. So you can see this here, multi-environment. So there is a need for multiple architectures, not just a single monolithic architecture, okay? Which obviously requires more integration and more dependency, because now you know that part of your system, part of your infrastructure depends on the cloud service provider, and part of it is within your IT department, and therefore you have to integrate them in a seamless manner. Now let's see what is moving to the cloud. your email system, your messaging systems, your conferencing, collaboration systems, storage, yes, compute power, productivity suites, Office 365 is an example. Very little business process applications, governance, compute power, yes, and yeah, private clouds. It gives you a sense of what is moving to the cloud. Not everything is moving to the cloud. It is not an answer for all problems that you have. All right? Definitely one of the benefits of cloud is it supports the on-demand model, and it makes your IT infrastructure simple, cutting through complexity. So that's the other one here. It is possible that if cloud becomes very, very successful, there will be no IT departments. Right? When electricity was invented, it was very important. Today, I don't think there is any organization in the world that has a chief electricity officer. Do you know of any organization that has a chief electricity officer? No, right? You take it for granted. That's what cloud is going to do. Right? CIO will become the chief innovation officer. There is no need for a chief technology officer. Unless you're a technology company, that's a different issue, but we are talking of non-technology user-side companies.